Afghanistan, and the United States is preserving democracy. And all of this, I mean, we are as much interested in democracy as the Russians are interested in socialism. In fact, we, over and over again have overthrown democratic regimes if they didn't do the kind of thing we wanted them to do. I mean, study after study has revealed the obvious, namely that American support and aid correlates essentially with the improvement of the investment climate. If a country is willing to open itself to our penetration and control our access to resources, allow our corporations to repatriate profits and so on, we will support them. Doesn't matter what kind of regime they have.
Given what we've said about the goals of Soviet foreign and military policy, how do you respond to the situation in Central America in terms of Soviet either influence or Soviet active involvement?
So, Tony, this discussion reminds me of the standard joke about have you stopped beating your wife. I mean, there's a presupposition here which is so grotesquely false that even to answer your question is impossible. I mean, it's as if there was a discussion going on in the Soviet Union where they asked, what's the extent of American intervention in Eastern Europe? Well, okay, maybe they have discussions about that, and if we looked at them, we would laugh. I mean, okay, maybe there's some intervention in Eastern Europe, but that's not the problem in Eastern Europe. I mean, the problem in Eastern Europe is Russian domination. Now, take a look at Latin America. I mean, Latin America has been subjected to American-supported, U.S.-supported terrorism and violence to a degree that is, I mean, unspeakable. I mean, let's forget about history. In 1961, the Kennedy administration made one of the most important decisions in modern history, which almost nobody in the United States knows about. Namely, they changed the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense, presumably against Martians, to internal security, meaning war against their own populations. And that decision led to a spread of a plague of bloodshed and repression and torture and violence over Latin America that has no precedent in the whole bloody history of the continent. As country after country was turned over to national security states with a kind of a Nazi model, and I mean that quite literally, with constant American intervention and support. Now we look at that history, and then we ask, what is the extent of Russian intervention in Latin America?
One of the things, it's true that we've done all these other things which really deserve to be criticized. At the same time, we've done some other things which you simply overlook, which indeed are worthwhile. We have tried some economic aid, and in some cases
the Russians. Yes, for example, in Afghanistan,
yes.
The Russians have done some decent things.
Yes, they have. I don't deny that for a second.
Fine, what does that have to do with anything? I mean, if we're talking about Afghanistan, we talk about Russian aggression, not the fact that they have, on the side, done some decent things to try to win people over. Of course they do.
Sure, okay, but I mean, the point is that there was a view of Russian interference in Latin America and in South America itself against, in some cases, the legitimate regimes, which weren't always wrong. I mean, that these countries have problems. They have economic problems, and indeed any kind of society in the third world generally has problems almost by definition. They're not strong democracies. They've got economic growth problems, and they lend themselves to criticism and pressure on either side. And let me just raise one other thing that as Americans, we really do give our country a hard time, deservedly so for the most part.
I wish that were true. What the problem in the United States is that we fail to criticize American policy. The amount of real critical analysis of American policy is minuscule in the United States, and what there is can never reach a mass audience.
One of the perceptions that is being suggested at the present time is that one way to demonstrate that the Soviets do have as a goal in their foreign military policy world domination is the size of their military, that it's not just a defensive type military, it's also offensive. And in fact, we're told that the Soviets are really militarily superior to the United States at the present time. So what about the Soviet military? First of all, is it true, would you say, that the Soviet military capacity is superior to that of the United States at the present?
Ask the Joint Chiefs, who are asked that every session of Congress. Constantly they ask them, well, would you trade the American military system for the Russian military system? And the answer is a horse laugh. We should tell the truth about the Russians. We should understand how repressive they are. We should understand how brutal they are and how aggressive they would be if they could get away with it, which they can't in most places. But if you look at the Russian military system, the fact is that its character is wildly exaggerated in American propaganda. And in fact, all of this has been exposed. It's been exposed over and over again, and the exposure has no effect. So, for example, take the way in which, for one thing, take the way in which the United States determines the character of the Soviet military system. I mean, this is such a, this is so farcical that people who know about it just laugh. I mean, what we do is the CIA calculates what's called the dollar equivalent of the Russian military expenditures. That means we ask how much would it cost us to produce the Russian military system. And the answer is some huge number. The reason it's some huge number is that they're so hopelessly inefficient. I mean, that's a labor-intensive system, backward labor-intensive system. And for us to create a backward labor-intensive system would be extremely expensive. I mean, for example, if you ask the question, what would it cost, what's the dollar equivalent of the Russian agricultural system? Suppose somebody asked that. What would it cost us to duplicate the Russian agricultural system? Well, the answer is it would bankrupt us. If we had to pay 100 million peasants to farm inefficiently, it would just would bankrupt us.
No,
but we don't conclude from that the Russians are ahead of us in agriculture. Now, the fact is, suppose you were to ask, what is the ruble equivalent of the American military system?
Well, we do.
But you know what the answer is? The answer is that it's infinite.
Yes.
Yeah, because the Russians simply cannot duplicate our military system. If they could spend every ruble they have in Russia, and they can't duplicate our military system, because it's just too advanced for them.
Well, at the very least, then, there's this adversarial relationship. Do either superpower want to change this? Or is each of them benefiting from this present situation? So much so that they're willing to escalate things even further.
I don't think either side benefits in any long-run sense, but I don't see any indication that either side is going to do something, take any unilateral action. It may very well be that the Russians could use the resources that are going to the military sector. They could certainly use them to, if they could be converted, which I don't think will be easy. So I don't see any, answer your question, I don't see any action at our level, I don't see any action at their level, and I think it comes, the motion that I do see is coming from kind of citizen activity, and I would only hope that there would be something comparable in the Soviet Union, and about that I'm not very optimistic either.
We cannot create initiatives in the Soviet Union, so it's pointless to discuss it. We can ask, what can we do here? Now, what we do here, if we want to be logical about it, has to be directed at two ends, at cutting down the American commitment to the arms race and at cutting down the Russian commitment to the arms race. And fortunately, the very same actions contribute to both of those ends. Now, just consider for a minute the dynamics of this system. We know that every time the Russians do something aggressive, it supports the hawks on our side, and every time they back off somewhere, it hurts the hawks on our side. And the system is mutual, it's symmetrical. So the fact of the matter is that the best way in which we can contribute to the reduction of aggression and militarism in the Soviet Union is by constraining our own militarism and aggression, which their hawks use, just as ours do, as a way of mobilizing their own populations. And in fact, my view is that's why the Cold War persists. In fact, it is highly functional for the more brutal and militaristic elements in both societies. It would also be helpful, we've pointed out, a number of, Marshall pointed out most strongly, and I agree with him, that one of the problems in the contemporary world is that there is no corresponding discussion inside the United States.
Soviet Union.
Inside the Soviet Union, sorry.
Yeah.
And that's correct. And I think we ought to also recognize that what is a fact, that there is very little discussion in the United States. The spectrum of discussion in the United States is extraordinarily narrow. I mean, it's not narrow because the government comes and throws you in a concentration camp. It's narrow for other reasons. But, for example, well, the things that I just said a few minutes ago, which Marshall doesn't agree with, fine, that's his right not to agree. But the point is, the things I have said literally cannot be expressed to any large audience in the United States. There is no way for those views to be expressed to anything more than a marginal audience in the United States. See, nobody stops me from getting up, let's say, at a college meeting called by a couple of students and saying these things. Mm-hmm. But everything stops me or anyone else who believes these things from approaching any large audience. Now, what that means is that, in effect, almost the entire discussion in the United States, and this is literally close to 100%, is within a very narrow framework of assumptions, and people who think that those assumptions are wrong, like me, simply have no access to any large audience.
Marshall keeps bringing up, well, I wish they had a movement comparable to ours. Well, given their history, given the fact they've never had any experience of popular democracy as we have with our voluntary organization, I think this is almost irrelevant. That's not going to happen in the same way. But on the other hand, from my experience there, which he agrees with, there's no denying that Soviet people across the board are fearful of another war. And I think there's been a lot of criticism of the bureaucracy. There are letters to the editor criticizing the bureaucracy. So if there was coexistence and there's pressure from the bottom for a more open society, wouldn't it seem reasonable that the government, as long as it doesn't feel threatened, would make some concessions to these pressures? To me, that is a common sense perspective. And I just wish that we had enough strength in our own system, you know, to move in that direction and away from this idea of name-calling and military threats. And it's a risk either way. I just remind us again, it's a risk either way, because each day that the present situation continues, there is a risk of war through accident. So let's take our risks on the basis of our own heritage and our belief in human beings as having this capacity to act reasonably in our own interest.